His name was removed from records, on purpose, not by accident, not by time, by people who had something to lose. And for over a century it worked. Most Americans have never heard of Bayard Rustin. But without him, there would be no March on Washington. No I Have a Dream speech. No modern civil rights movement as we know it. He organized the largest protest in American history. He was the architect behind Martin Luther King Jr.'s strategy. He changed the face of America, and then he vanished. Not physically. Worse, from memory, from textbooks, from history itself. This is the story of a man so dangerous to the establishment that even his own allies had to pretend he didn't exist. A man whose brilliance was so undeniable that erasing him required a conspiracy that stretched across decades. And the reason they did it? It had nothing to do with his ideas. It had everything to do with who he loved. August 28, 1963. Over 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. You've seen the photos. You know the speech, but you don't know who made it happen. While Martin Luther King Jr. stood at that podium, there was a man in the shadows. A man who had spent months coordinating every bus, every train, every hotel room. A man who had designed the entire event down to the minute. His name was supposed to be announced that day. He was supposed to be recognized as the chief organizer. But at the last second, it was removed from the program. Why? Because 2 months earlier, a senator had made a phone call. And that phone call set off a chain reaction that would define American history for the next 60 years. Bayard Rustin was gay. And in 1963, that made him a weapon. Not against himself. Against everyone who stood with him. The FBI knew it. The segregationists knew it. And they were ready to use it. Strom Thurmond, a notorious segregationist senator, stood on the Senate floor and held up Bayard's arrest record. Morals charges from years prior. Humiliating details. All of it entered into the congressional record. The message was clear. If you let this man represent your movement, we will destroy you. And it worked. The civil rights leaders had a choice. Protect Bayard. Or protect the movement. They chose the movement. Martin Luther King Jr., the man Bayard had mentored, the man he had taught nonviolent resistance, stayed silent. Not because he wanted to, because he had to, and Bayard understood. He stepped back, into the shadows, where he would remain for decades. But here's what they didn't understand. Here's what the FBI, the segregationists, the politicians didn't count on. You can erase a man from the cameras, but you can't erase his mind. And Bayard Rustin's mind was about to reshape America in ways they never saw coming. Let's go back. Before the march. Before King. Before any of it. Because to understand why they erased him, you need to understand what made him so dangerous. Bayard Rustin didn't start in the civil rights movement. He started in the labor movement, in pacifism, in socialism. He was a Quaker, a conscientious objector during World War II. He refused to fight and went to prison for it. While in prison, he organized protests against segregation inside the facility. He was beaten, put in solitary confinement, and when he got out, he didn't stop. He traveled to India, studied under followers of Gandhi, brought those ideas back to America. And in 1955, when a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. was thrust into the spotlight after the Montgomery bus boycott, Bayard showed up. He knocked on King's door, and he taught him everything. Nonviolent resistance, how to organize, how to turn a local protest into a national movement. King later said Bayard was one of the most important influences in his life. But you won't find that in most history books, because in 1960, Bayard was arrested again. Morals charge, a setup many believed, but it didn't matter. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., a powerful black congressman, gave King an ultimatum. Distance yourself from Bayard, or I will publicly claim you two are having an affair. King had no choice. He cut ties. Bayard resigned from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, stepped away from the movement he had helped build. And for a while, it seemed like the establishment had won. But then something unexpected happened. The movement needed him again. In 1963, a Philip Randolph, the elder statesman of black activism, was planning the March on Washington. It was supposed to be the largest demonstration in American history. Buses from every state, speeches, media coverage, but nobody knew how to pull it off. The logistics were impossible, except for one man, Randolph called Bayard, and despite everything, despite the humiliation, the erasure, the betrayal, Bayard said yes. He had 8 weeks. He organized transportation for 250,000 people, coordinated with churches, unions, and activist groups across the country, designed the stage, planned the program, even arranged for portable toilets. And he did it all from a cramped office in Harlem with a skeleton crew. The March on Washington was a logistical masterpiece. It's still studied today as one of the greatest feats of mass organizing in history. But when the day came, Bayard's name was barely mentioned. The media gave credit to King, to Randolph, to the other leaders on stage, but not to Bayard. And it wasn't an accident. The Kennedy administration had pressured the march organizers. They were terrified of protests turning violent, terrified of bad press, and they knew that if the media dug into Bayard's past, it could derail everything. So they made a deal. Keep him out of sight. Keep him out of the press. And in return, the administration would support the movement. Bayard agreed. Again, because for him, it was never about recognition. It was about results. But the cost was his legacy. Here's where it gets darker. Because the erasure didn't stop after the march. It accelerated. In the 1970s, when textbooks and documentaries about the civil rights movement started being made, Bayard was left out. Deliberately, publishers didn't want controversy. Schools didn't want to explain why one of the movement's key figures was gay. So they just omitted him. A generation of Americans grew up learning about Rosa Parks, about King, about Malcolm X, but not about Bayard Rustin. And it wasn't just white institutions doing this. It was black institutions too, because homophobia didn't stop at the color line. Even within the civil rights movement, there was a deep discomfort with sexuality, especially homosexuality. Many leaders believed that presenting a respectable image was critical. Suits, ties, traditional families. Bayard didn't fit that mold, and so he was quietly written out. But here's the thing about history. The truth always finds a way out. In the 1980s, a new generation of activists started asking questions. Why wasn't Bayard Rustin in the history books? Why was his name missing from documentaries? And slowly, the story started to emerge. Academics began writing about him. Activists began honoring him. And a few brave voices began demanding that his story be told. But even then, there was resistance. Because acknowledging Bayard meant acknowledging something uncomfortable. It meant admitting that the civil rights movement, for all its moral clarity, had its own prejudices, its own blind spots. It meant admitting that America had erased a hero because of who he loved. And that truth was hard to swallow. But the evidence was undeniable. Bayard's papers, his speeches, his letters, all of it was there, hidden in archives, waiting to be discovered. And when people finally looked, they realized something astonishing. Bayard Rustin wasn't just an organizer. He was a visionary. He didn't just fight for black Americans. He fought for all marginalized people. In the 1970s and 80s, when most civil rights leaders stayed silent on LGBTQ issues, Bayard spoke out. He marched in pride parades. He lobbied for gay rights. He connected the dots. He saw that the struggle for racial justice and the struggle for LGBTQ rights were part of the same fight. He said, "The barometer of where one is on human rights questions is no longer the black community. It's the gay community." That was in 1986, decades before marriage equality, decades before mainstream acceptance. Bayard Rustin was ahead of his time, again, and still most Americans didn't know his name. So why does this matter now? Because Bayard Rustin's story isn't just about the past. It's about right now. Every day, people are erased from history, not because they weren't important, but because they made someone uncomfortable, because they were too radical, too different, too dangerous to the status quo. And the people who erase them count on one thing, that we won't ask questions. But we're asking now. In 2013, 50 years after the March on Washington, President Barack Obama posthumously awarded Bayard Rustin the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It was the highest honor a civilian can receive. And finally, after decades, the country acknowledged what he had done. But even that moment was bittersweet, because Bayard didn't live to see it. He died in 1987, alone, still relatively unknown. He spent his final years fighting for the causes he believed in: AIDS awareness, prison reform, economic justice. He never stopped, even when the world had forgotten him. And here's the most painful part. Bayard Rustin never asked to be erased. He never chose to be in the shadows, but he accepted it, because he believed in something bigger than himself. He believed that movements matter more than individuals, that justice matters more than recognition. But what if he was wrong? What if erasing him didn't protect the movement? What if it weakened it? Because when we hide people like Bayard, we teach future generations a lie. We teach them that only certain kinds of people can be heroes. We teach them that if you're different, you have to hide. You have to shrink. You have to apologize for who you are. And that's exactly the opposite of what Bayard Rustin stood for. Today, his name is slowly being reclaimed. Schools are teaching about him. Documentaries are being made. A movie about his life was released in 2023. But it's not enough. Because for every person who knows about Martin Luther King Jr., only a handful know about Bayard Rustin. And that imbalance tells a story about who we choose to remember and who we choose to forget. Bayard Rustin organized one of the most important events in American history. He mentored Martin Luther King Jr. He fought for justice his entire life. And they erased him, not because he failed, but because he succeeded. And because he did it while being unapologetically himself. So let me ask you this. How many other Bayard Rustins are out there? How many other people changed the world only to be written out of the story? And what does it say about us that we let it happen? Bayard Rustin's life is a reminder that history isn't neutral, that the stories we tell and the stories we don't tell shape everything, and that sometimes the most important people are the ones no one wants you to know about. His name was removed from records, on purpose, but now you know, and once you know, you can't unknow. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?